I was given very strict instructions to be finished in 15 minutes, which is the format, as you know. And somebody was saying to me at the table, well, it'll be no problem for you finishing in the right time and doing it quickly because you're a broadcaster, by which he meant if you want shrill, glib judgments delivered in double quick time, I'm your man. The story of Kohima and the Japanese invasion of India came to me by an extraordinary route. As a war correspondent, I'm naturally predisposed to soldiers, not to stories, not just about soldiers, but about people caught up in war. And also, I'm predisposed to stories of empire. I grew up in a country that had once been part of the British Empire. The first conflict I covered was in Northern Ireland, one of those conflicts which arose from empire. And I looked at what I'd been doing for much of the last 20 years, whether it was in the Balkans, whether it was in Africa, or indeed in Asia. And I discovered that most of the wars that I was reporting on had emerged from the ruins of various different empires. Now, while I was covering South Africa, a friend of mine told me one day about a battle that his father had been involved in India, in a place called Kohima. I'd never heard of it. And he said, my father is dying and he wants to be able to leave behind a memoir for the family. Would you mind coming and interviewing him? Because you're used to drawing people out. So I did. Over several weekends, I went and spoke to John Shipster about this battle at Kohima. And I, at that stage, had covered quite a few wars myself. I'd read a great deal of history, military history. But the story he told me of 1,500 English and Indian troops surrounded by 15,000 Japanese was the most extraordinary war story I'd ever heard. The siege took place over a fortnight, and at the very end, the British-Indian perimeter had come down to just 300 yards. So you can imagine, try to picture 1,500 men trapped in a 300-yard perimeter and surrounded by 15,000 Japanese troops. It began, the whole story of Kohima began as an imperial adventure. In late 1943, early 1944, Japan looked around and realized that with the entrance and advance of America into the war, the country was being strangled. Right across the Pacific, the Americans were advancing across islands and getting closer, gradually through incredibly hard fighting, but getting closer to the home islands of Japan. The Japanese needed a gesture. They needed something dramatic to show to people at home that the cause was not lost. And it fell to one man, Kotoku Sato. I think we can see his photograph here in a moment. It fell to him to lead the assault out of Burma, which the Japanese had captured, and into India. And the idea was that if Sato could capture this hill station at Kohima, plant the Japanese flag there, but also plant the flag of a free India, because he was going to bring with him, as part of that Japanese army, soldiers of the Indian National Army. And these were people who were bitterly opposed to the British presence, who rejected Gandhi and Nehru's politics of negotiation and compromise and peaceful protest, and who believed in armed insurrection. So these were going to, the Japanese and the Indian National Army were going to cross the border into India and surround Kohima and Imphal, the other great British base. And in doing so, the Japanese High Command, led by a man called Mutaguchi, whom we can see in a moment as well, they believed that they could spark an insurrection in India, destabilize the British, and crucially for them, consolidate their hold on Burma. So it was going to be this essential victory. Now, this character here is one of the great vainglorious fools of history. Now, the Second World War threw up quite a few of them, but this guy is in a class of his own. Mutaguchi had been instrumental in starting the war in China in the 1930s. And he was constantly, he'd been involved in the fall of Singapore, but he was looking at this stage in the war for something dramatic that was going to catapult him into the front ranks. And he saw the whole plan to invade India as the vehicle which would make him the most famous Japanese commander of the Second World War. And he really did believe in the fabled march on Delhi, in being able to overthrow British power in India. What he neglected to do, however, was to plan in any sensible and sane way. So, for example, when he was asked, how are you going to feed these thousands of troops that you're sending into India. He said, I'll do it like Genghis Khan. We'll take our food on the hoof. So his men were sent out to round up every stray cow, ox, anything with four legs essentially that moved on the Burmese side of the border. And they were told to take them on a training walk. And so these animals were marched up and down for around 24 hours along the banks of the Irrawaddy River. And the men reported back that yes, the animals were able to go that distance. But of course, the Japanese who were invading Burma and going to take these animals with them, or invading India, were going to have to climb mountains that rose from 10 to 18,000 feet through thick jungle. And of course, within a few days of the invasion starting, the animals started to die. And I remember Japanese soldiers whom I interviewed telling me how they would set fire to the tails of the oxen to try and get them to rise. And on the first occasion, the animal would, naturally get to its feet and keep going. Second time, it would get up and keep going. But usually by the third time, not even a burning tail could get these exhausted animals moving. By the time the Japanese were a week into their advance, men were already dying of starvation, dysentery. One of the accounts from a war correspondent traveling with the Japanese describes just green, as far as he could see in the jungle, green pools of dysentery as men were becoming more and more ill. Now, when they arrived at Kohima, and perhaps we can have a look at Kohima now, just to give you, that's the Kohima Valley. It gives you an idea of the kind of terrain that men were going to be asked to fight on. Where you see this white building to the left, all around there was where the British and Indian positions were concentrated. And the Japanese would shell them from the ridgeline there and then gradually advance across that valley to them. By the time General Sato arrived, as I've said, many of his men were starving. There was a huge shortage, not just of food, but of ammunition and medical supplies. But they launched all 15,000 against this tiny British Indian garrison. And the descriptions that the men who fought there gave to me all concentrated on one thing, or they all began with one thing, and that was still, 60 years after the battle, a sense of shock that no matter how much they fired at the Japanese who were coming towards them, these men wouldn't stop. They kept coming and coming. Now, on one level, men were horrified. The average British and Indian soldier was taught that, yes, you should fight bravely, but at the end of the day, war was about surviving. It wasn't about throwing your life away. Here they were against an enemy for whom life seemed to mean nothing. And of course, if he held his own life with such little regard, God only knows what he was going to do to you when he got his hands on you. And indeed, patrols which went out, at night sometimes the British and Indians would send out patrols into the hills in secret, and they would come across some of their own men who'd been captured. And invariably, these men would have been crucified, tied to trees and crucified, or tied tightly with barbed wire and used for bayonet practice. By this stage in the war, men knew what was happening in the prisoner of war camps as well. I mean, that news was filtering out of places like Thailand and out of Burma. They also knew what had happened in the occupation of China, the massacres that had taken place. So those 1,500 men who were defending Kohima, as I say, knew that if they were captured, only one of two things was going to happen. You were going to be tortured to death, or you would end up as a slave laborer and die of disease and starvation in a prisoner of war camp. So there was a very strong, beyond duty to empire or duty to your regiment or even duty to the man beside you, there was the, imperative of saving your own life by fighting as hard as you could. And all of them were quite frank about that was the primary thing. I would say to people, what was it, at the beginning anyway, but when I expected, I suppose, more idealistic responses, and I would say to people, what was it you were fighting for? And it was really simple. It was to stay alive. Now, over the 2 weeks that the siege took place, as I say, the perimeter shrank and it shrank. And the Japanese kept coming in human waves. And there, of course, was a huge problem with the wounded. There was nowhere to put them. Imagine all of that. Now, take out the buildings from that and imagine a bare hillside. All of the trees had been destroyed in the shelling. I think we can have a look at the bungalow, which was the main centre. This was the district commissioner's bungalow, classic little pretty Raj bungalow where people played tennis and drank pink gin even in the days before the siege began. Now let's take a look at it afterwards. It was absolutely reduced, and you can imagine them trying to cater for wounded men lying out in the open. It was very hard to get any purchase on the ground, so the wounded were lying in the open, and the Japanese deliberately shelled the wounded. They shelled with mortars, with artillery. They used snipers on the wounded. And throughout this, men continued to risk their lives, the stretcher bearers in particular, the medics, to go out and treat men who were lying screaming in the open. And what everybody also talks about there is the great swarms of flies as they were besieged. Because where were you going to bury people? You know, you had very, very shallow graves. So the bodies, Japanese and British, accumulated. Occasionally, one side or the other would try and burn the bodies of the dead. And that, of course, only added to the sense of horror that existed there. And men describing to me, I remember one man, Dennis Wykes, who was from Coventry, who joined the British Army after witnessing the bombing of Coventry, I think with some kind of intent of vengeance on his mind. And war had drawn out the hero in him. He was an incredibly brave person. But I think it had also reduced him, his experience of that terrible little acre at Kohima had destroyed much of his faith in humanity. He described to me how he had seen one of his own men who'd gone right through the siege, the 13th day, suddenly turned to him and said, "I can't take this, I'm getting out of here." And drawing his rifle on his own friend and soldier and saying, "If you do, I'll put a bullet in your back." That's what it drew from people. The British eventually, and the Indians, held out long enough for relief to get to them. Now, the battle itself continued for another 6 weeks after the relief, the Japanese continually throwing their men against the British lines. But eventually, General Sato did something that no other Japanese commander had ever done. He refused orders to fight on. He said, "I'm going to retreat." And he took his men along what became known as the Road of Bones. And as they retreated, they starved in their thousands. Men begged their officers to kill them. Whatever grenades they had left, they would gather in a group. One of the phenomenon was that groups of men would come together, hug each other, and press a grenade and kill each other, There was this last comfort before death. Other soldiers described to me, I spent a lot of time in Japan talking to people, how they would come to rivers and see alongside the bank of each river the skeletons of men who'd come there to drink. And of course, knowing that very soon they were going to join them themselves. And this trail of death went all the way down into Burma. General Sato was sacked for having taken the decision to retreat. And when he went back to Japan in disgrace, Mutaguchi, the great architect of this disaster, tried to have him declared insane. And they sent 3 of the army's top psychiatrists to examine Sato. And they went and they said, "No, he's the sanest man we have ever interviewed. He did the right thing by ordering a retreat." And when Sato went back to Japan, in disgrace, drummed out of the army, he put on his army greatcoat and for 3 years after the war went to the homes of the men who had died serving under him, as many of them as he could find, to say a prayer with the families of the dead. When he died, Mutaguchi had the nerve to turn up at his funeral and walked in and said to the family, "I'm very sorry for what I've done," and then walked back out and 2 weeks after that gave an interview to the Japanese parliamentary researcher, knowing that this wouldn't be published for 30 years, in which he denounced General Sato and said he was a coward and he was mad. But to this day, Sato is the man whom, when you talk to Japanese veterans and even talk to English officers who went there and spoke to them and met their families, he is the man who is held in universally high regard for doing something very few people in that war, particularly in the Far East, ever did, and that was to put his men first. It's a quite extraordinary story. Thank you very much.